Hello. Okay, I'm going to take some time to look at this video that was put out by Professor Dave Explains. He's taking uh, uh, he's taken issue with James Tour. Now, James Tour is a avowed Christian, also a scientist who specifically works on nanotechnology, particularly, but is a pretty smart guy around science in general. Uh, I found a Professor Dave video just showed up on my YouTube feed, and I started watching it, and I really started to think about what this guy's trying to say. And he starts off pretty abrasively and pretty dismissively in character assassination. And I, posted some things in that regard, and he responded back that I don't understand what an ad hominem attack is, which is essentially that when you make fun of somebody or mischaracterize them or you take issue with their character rather than point by point on their arguments, uh, that's an ad hominem attack, saying, "Oh, you don't know anything because you didn't go to college. You don't know anything because you were born this way or that way." That's an ad hominem attack, and I could post his replies, and I might do that later. Uh, I was just pointing out that he was attacking somebody on their character and disqualifying them just because they have a faith in God and faith in Christ and believe in the Bible. He thinks that automatically makes you a science denier, and he automatically makes you somebody disqualified from making comments on scientific things. In this case, abiogenesis, which means something from nothing, how life arose randomly from nothing, um, without life coming from nothing, essentially. If you want to look up the definition, feel free to. I'm going to be very high level. I'm not going digging deep in this. I'm not a scientist. I am not college educated in science, and I'm not pretending to be. All I'm doing is taking this video as an example of how someone like Professor Dave makes arguments and makes points of issues that from Christians and creationists and accuses them of straw men and straw men, which is like making fun of something that's or mischaracterizing something or setting something up uh, that's easily pushed over. A straw man. If you're trying to fight a straw man, you just set up this guy in clothes with some straw and you punch him and you knock him down. So essentially, if you cast a argument in a certain frame and you knock it down, that's called a straw man argument. So if you mischaracterize someone's position or take a wrong approach or flat out lie about a position and then go about and disproving that position, you've done what's called a straw man attack. So I'm going to play a few clips from here, quite a few, and let you hear what he has to say, and then we'll just comment and see if I'm right or not. And I'm straight up. I'll be straight up with you. The idea that he is putting forth, and he explains his ideas pretty clearly with no apologies, and he gets to it clearly at the end. It's a summary, but he does imply that the earth as it is had to have an ocean, had to have some water, had to have minerals, and had to have some molecules pre-existing, and it had to be a spark, a lightning spark, for us to get that. And in order to have all of those things, you had to have planets and stars. You had to have this arrangement of material in the universe in a particular way with particular molecules and particular resources in this particular water with a particular spark. And I'm not making a mischaracterization, and I'm not mischaracterizing at all what he says. I'm laying it out, and he will say it at the end, and you can watch this. Here's the YouTube URL right at the top, and then I'll post some notes about it. But he literally lays his whole plan out on these things have to pre-exist in order for this to happen, maybe. So if you're going to denigrate people that have a faith in a God who is documented in literature and on pages of a book in history, and has made scientific claims in this book that have been proven true and were way ahead of science at the time. That is the basis of an entire nation, the nation of Israel, claims their source from this. And if you want to take that and all the biblical archaeology that was confirming the scriptures and the near perfect reproductions of all the manuscripts that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. They've yet to find one that contradicts the modern manuscripts, even as far back as, maybe 100 years or so after the events of the Bible, or less than that, when the first manuscripts were written. That compared to Shakespeare or Plato or Socrates, it pales in comparison. The Bible has orders of magnitude more evidence for validity than any of those old books put together, literally all put together. So our faith is based on a documentation that an entity came into our planet with a name that's been historically verified and historically corroborated, a person named Jesus in Nazareth in Israel, and who was crucified and did spawn a movement of Christians. That is irrefutable in history. Beyond that, there's many things you can investigate to clarify whether you believe in the Bible or not, whether it's true or not. But my take is I'm going to look at the creation by God, creation. Bible says clearly ex nihilo is the meaning of from nothing. God spoke his word. He himself was the substance of all things. He himself embodies all the substance necessary for creation, and he himself is life and light. And that when he spoke, these things were created. They appeared, and they happened to be as they are. I'm not going to get into fossils. I'm not going to get into those things. That's a whole different scope. What we're talking about is the actual genesis of life. How did it all begin? Funny how they have Genesis in there, because it's the beginning. So with that, I'm going to start the video, and you can listen, and you can watch, and you can comment.
Atheists also love to talk about how impossible abiogenesis seems, which is a word that refers to the initial emergence of living organisms from small molecules a little over 4 billion years ago, whether they simply have no understanding of biochemistry or are pushing a religious agenda, or both. They are quite vocal in proclaiming the notion to be absurd. Some of them like to pretend that academia is on their side, and their patron saint in this endeavor is James Tour, a synthetic organic chemist that speaks out against abiogenesis. Several hundred times I've been linked to a particular video of his, always by somebody presuming that his expertise in chemistry makes him the final authority on this matter. Let's get a taste of that video now.
We don't even know how to make the molecules. We are lost on how to do this. We can't even make the basic building blocks. But even if we could, from prebiotic type environment to make these, with all the intellect that we put into this, even if we could make them, we have no idea how to assemble them.
So that's James Tour, and as we will see, he is very emphatic about his rejection of abiogenesis as a feasible process. But he is even more emphatic about something else, and we should make this known immediately so as to properly contextualize this discussion.
Not only am I Christian, but I love Jesus tremendously. He is the best. He is everything to me. I am much more than just a Christian in name.
Jesus Christ rose from the dead. He is the Son of God, and it's on that I based my faith. And I opened my eyes. I was on my knees. I opened my eyes. Who's in my room? That man, Jesus Christ, stood in my room.
So that should give you a better picture of the headspace he is coming from. Now, before we get started, I want to make it clear that this video is not specifically intended to be a character assassination of Dr. Tour. This is for two reasons. First, he is not a con man like most of the people I debunk. He's not deliberately peddling misinformation to make money on the internet. He is a respected chemist. And second, although the reasoning behind his stance on abiogenesis is clearly religiously motivated, despite his best efforts to convince people otherwise, he is entitled to his religious beliefs. I am not making this video to mock everyone who believes that some sentient entity was involved in the origin of life on Earth, partially because it's not something I can readily disprove the way one can trivially disprove a young Earth. This video is aimed at science-illiterate people who blindly link to Dr. Tour in an empty argument from authority to confirm their own bias and push an anti-science agenda.
All right, so right there, and I'm going to get a little bit more into this. So he is assuming that Dr. Tor is rejecting abiogenesis because of religion, not because it's not scientific, not because it's not provable, not because it is anything other than yet another faith that requires you to believe something and accept a premise in order for all these things to line up. And we'll get more into that as the video goes on. So he doesn't want to mock him, but then he says, well, that's where his headspace is. Just so you can get a picture where his headspace is, someone who loves Jesus, how can you take that man seriously? You see how that sets up a straw man, like he's mischaracterizing him, and he's setting this man up as it's an ad hominem attack. You're attacking the person's character. You're disqualifying him. Why are you disqualifying someone with faith in God when all the early scientists, Newton, Pascal, et cetera, these are all people that had a faith in God, and they are revered as scientists. So by saying because you have faith, it's going to cloud your ability to see science, again, that you are creating something, you're creating a rule book, you're creating a way of casting this guy's argument and making it invalid rather than dealing with the points. Now, he does deal with the points a little later, but again, it always comes back to this type of character assassination, which he claims he's not doing.
With that understood, I want to do a few things. First, I want to go through some of Dr. Tor's talking points and explain how some of them are reasonable while most are not. It is clear that his religious views cloud his capacity to interpret research on this topic, as does his gross overestimation of his own abilities. While it is true that as an organic chemist, he has a dramatically enhanced capacity to understand this topic over a layperson, it is still not his area of research. Pretending a synthetic organic chemist is best equipped to understand the origin of life just because they build small molecules is like pretending that a particle physicist is best equipped to understand organic chemistry, something which Dr. Tor would vehemently disagree with.
Sorry, I had some other notes I needed to clear up. So one of the things that this gentleman is claiming that, and he's actually exhibiting a bigoted commentary, by saying what he's not trying to do, he's slipping in his bigotry. Oh, I'm not trying to accuse this man of not knowing what he's doing. I'm certainly not trying to denigrate his respected chemistry, but he doesn't work in that field, you know. So it's this kind of left-handed compliment that he throws at him disingenuously to slip in as he chips away at James Tor's credibility. That's all he's trying to do. And he's claiming that people are in it for the money. Other people he's debunking. Maybe there's some people that are. That out there who makes a business out of Christian apologetics and trying to educate the public. And if that person is doing that full time, why shouldn't they make money from what they're doing? That's if they're doing a good job, they should get paid. If they write books, they should get paid to write books. If somebody's out there quote peddling, is he monetizing his videos? Is he getting paid for what he does? So taking this kind of holier than thou thing, like thou art unclean because you get paid. Again, all this is doing is casting dispersions on people and lumping them together in a big group and saying dirty, filthy people trying to do these bad things. So I just take issue with that, and I think you should listen closely when people are doing these things because it's subtle. It gets past your discriminating mind, your thoughtful mind, and it feels like, right, yeah, all Christians are in it for the money. That's what it's all about, yeah. Yeah, for the first 300 years of Christianity, they were pretty much destroyed and are the most persecuted group of people on earth even today. So, yeah, there are certainly the televangelists and there are certainly people in it for the money, quote unquote. But let's not forget those who make money from books, who get grants, who gets paid speaking engagements. Look, everybody's in something for the money. So let's not try to cast yourself as something that you're not and claim a position that you don't really hold.
Origin of life research is a complex, multidisciplinary field. It is not his expertise, nor in his authority to flippantly dismiss, as he attempts to do, oftentimes with reasoning that ignores basic facts in biology. Second, I want to go through some of the very common but embarrassingly invalid talking points that uneducated creationists use when discussing abiogenesis. Dr. Tour is much too smart to use these, but because I hear them all the time and we are on the subject anyway, there are a couple greatest hits that deserve to be dissected. And lastly, I want to briefly highlight where research in abiogenesis stands, mainly to demonstrate that most detractors have absolutely zero capacity to comprehend it, but also to show that while we don't know precisely what happened billions of years ago to get life started, we have a lot of it mapped out, with multiple cogent possibilities for each step. And to those with a reasonable understanding of biochemistry, it's not far-fetched in the slightest.
I'm sorry. He's making a lot of claims here, and they sound substantial because what? He's a scientist, Professor Dave. So he himself is claiming an authority and speaking from authority. So he's going to explain all these things, but he's literally saying most people don't have the capacity to even comprehend. So what does that do? Like, what do you mean I can't comprehend? Did everybody did he understand these things before he was educated? Or does it require education? Or is it, as he'll later say, common sense has no place in science? Whoa, didn't know that. So, wow, that's an interesting take. So everything that seems to be evident to anyone is actually an illusion, and until you're educated, you can't see the truth. What does that sound like? Does that sound like a cult? Does that sound like, oh, you can't know the truth until some authority in a white coat tells you the truth? Does that sound like a priesthood? Does that sound like a gospel? Does that sound like a religion? I don't know. I'm kind of feeling that from this guy, that we don't have the capacity. We must be born again. We must be educated because we can't know these things. But how does he know what happened billions of years ago? Yeah, he's going to have his list that he's going to debunk. But again, these are mostly all straw man arguments. And in some cases, there are probably people out there who are going off half-cocked that don't really know what they're talking about and taking an approach that sounds folksy and it sounds down-to-earth type of thing. And, of course, these people despise that. Despise that type of idea, that common sense is something to be poo-pooed and put away. Certainly, we can understand what that means. So we just continue to go on.
So to begin, let's check out more of what Dr. Tour has to say.
When one looks at a typical textbook, one will see some prehistoric pond and molecules, and those molecules coming together and forming a cell, and those cells coming together and some slithering creature coming out of this pond. That is fallacious. There is no truth in that.
This is one version of a talking point Jim brings up a lot. He hates how in some textbooks you see a primordial soup of molecules, some lightning, and then all of a sudden a cell is there, and then maybe a lizard crawling onto land, or something like that. To call this a complete view of abiogenesis and evolution would be absurd, but absolutely no one proposes this. This is something that a lot of creationists do. They refer to what is very obviously a textbook meant for middle school students and pretend it represents the pinnacle of scientific thought on the matter.
Funny thing about this point is at the end of the video, he literally favors the idea that there's this tidal pool with water and minerals on the rocks and lightning hits it to create this life. Now, that life does not mean some creature crawls out, that this thing is super assembled. What he's talking about, and I think correctly, if people do think that there's lightning striking and there's a creature emerging, which he admits is taught in these middle school books, admits it by making fun of it and saying that's where he gets his ideas from, Ted Tour gets his ideas from, that he considers a straw man. But he's just saying that, no, a lizard doesn't come out, but all these amino acids are formed, and those amino acids try working together, and they start eventually out, they all come together and create this sequence. The sequence is this particular protein, and after all this randomness, once this beautiful protein appears, the randomness stops, and this protein starts replicating, and we get where we're at today. So it's just simply a condensing of what he would need billions of years, and he claims billions of years to get from that tidal pool, which magically stays the same and doesn't change and doesn't evaporate. It doesn't change context or content, and the lightning repeatedly hits other places enough times for this to happen. We'll get into statistics later. But yeah, I can see where he doesn't like that characterization, but he is admitting that that's essentially what's being taught. Just the timeline is condensed for easy understanding from a middle school student. So, but the idea that this could happen in this tidal pool is the seed is planted in the mind of a middle school student. So when they do get to college, which he'll say, that the true pinnacle of science is still built on that same idea that there's a tidal pool, there's minerals, there's lightning, there's the beginning of life, and then over time, lots and lots of chances, lots and lots of iterations, you get these mature organisms that can replicate and eventually become rational creatures, and then try to explain how they got here. So let's go with that.
Sixth graders have zero capacity to understand biochemistry, so their textbook doesn't have any biochemistry in it. A college-level textbook will not look like this, so this is a dishonest talking point.
We do not know how to build even a simple bacterium. The simplest bacterium with its 256 protein coding genes, we have no idea how to build it. First of all, we don't know how to build the molecules, the 4 classes of molecules that are needed for it. We don't know how to, even if we had those 4 classes of molecules, assemble them even into the simplest of bacteriums. We don't know how to do that.
So there are 2 enormous problems with this. Jim is constantly talking about how we don't know how to make the 4 classes of biomolecules, which are nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. This is ridiculous. Nucleic acid synthesis and protein synthesis are utterly trivial. It's so easy to do that we even figured out how to make machines that do it for us. We type in the sequence we want on a computer, let the machine run, and we can get a DNA strand of any sequence of nucleotides we want, or a protein of any sequence of amino acids we want. Carbohydrates are a bit more complex since, despite consisting of the same monomer over and over, they can connect in a number of different ways. So synthesizing polysaccharides is trickier, though we are making progress with that too. And lipids like triglycerides can be synthesized easily. Any biomolecule is easy to synthesize. Jim knows this. He's a synthetic chemist. What he probably means is that we haven't seen these biomacromolecules form spontaneously outside of a biological system. But that's not what he says. He does not make the distinction, and this seems deliberate on his part. Next, he talks about us being unable to assemble a simple bacterium. This is absolutely irrelevant. The instructions for assembly are encoded in the DNA, and DNA predates all bacteria. The issue is to arrive at the bacterial genome, not to somehow be able to assemble a complete bacterium from its fully formed constituent parts, because nature doesn't do that either. Nature assembled some dramatically simpler precursor, which was self-replicating and also self-improving due to
This is where Professor Dave starts really showing where he's coming from. I think we understand that what he takes issue with is when James Tour is characterizing the fully mature organism, the lizard of some organism coming out of the pond, fully formed and walking the earth after a spark. And he's saying, no, that's not what happens. Nature creates these precursors. He talks about precursors, things that exist before other things, and these precursors become self-replicating and self-improving. But how does a strand of protein know that it's the right strand? If you're mixing all these amino acids together that seem to exist, all these molecules that need to exist, all the minerals that need to exist together to get this strand in a random order over untold billions and billions of iterations, how does that one thing know that it's the right protein strand, that it can self-replicate? And he makes this point over and over that it just does. It just simply does. It just starts replicating and it starts improving. Well, how do you measure improvement in a random world? How does a protein know that it needs to survive? How does that protein know that it needs to replicate? How does that protein even have the environment to work within to replicate, to create something, to respond and to adjust itself going forward? Well, time and chance. Statistics is what he'll say, what Professor Dave says. Certainly, with enough time, anything can happen. If it can happen once, it can happen lots of times. And he makes that point, actually says that. I'm not mischaracterizing. He actually says that. So when you face with this, that all you really have is time and chance, and certainly because it happens once, it can happen multiple times. Statistically, probably, why wouldn't I go with that? And I think the best person who wrote a book on that is Michael Behe. I think he's a professor or doctor, one of the two, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. Now, the scientific community just took Professor Behe down, just killed him, basically. And he was just questioning this. It's like, basically, Darwin's black box is the time and chance. You throw ingredients into a big black box of time and shake it up over enough period of time, you're going to get something that comes out statistically, purely statistically. Now, I think back to good old common sense. If I gave you the components of a pen, let's say a ballpoint pen, the ink, the tube, the ball, the point, the stylus, all the pieces all ready to go, and you just had to shake it up over a lot of time and it would self-assemble and come together and be functional, I think you'd laugh at that idea. You know what you'd get at the end of it. You'd get a box full of ink and splatter and broken plastic, and over time you would just basically be dust. It's similar to the old argument that with enough monkeys and typewriters and times, I can create Shakespeare. Well, again, common sense would laugh at that and say, you get a bunch of dead monkeys and monkey poop everywhere. But, these ideas that evolution has put forth is with enough time and the right circumstances. If. Statistically, maybe, probably, and it could possibly happen that these things happened. Does that sound like faith? Does that sound like putting your faith in something? Even though you could maybe show in a lab that it happened in a very base level, one thing can happen, and therefore all these other things can happen. That makes me say, as they love to call us, that we use God to fill in all the gaps. And I'm saying, well, you use time to fill in all the gaps. You use chance to fill in the gaps. So let's at least be on the same level. And if you're going to make fun of us, we can turn that right around on them and say, you say we have God of the gaps. We say you have time and chance of the gaps. So what's the difference? Your faith is in time and chance. Our faith is in a living being who demonstrated himself and walked this earth and recorded that in a book. So I'd put that up against anything. Let's continue.
To natural selection. Every bacterial cell alive today is tremendously more complex than the first protocell that must have formed, so this is not a valid argument. It's also incredibly anti-intellectual. We can't make planets and stars either. Does that mean nature can't have made them spontaneously?
there would be no inherent information in the DNA. But even if we gave them the DNA in the structure that they wanted, they wouldn't know how to put all the components together.
This is just nonsense. He is saying there is no information inherent in the DNA when DNA is inherently information because of the way genes code for protein.
I don't think that's what James Tour is saying. Anybody that knows anything about DNA knows that it is information. It's a programmed language that is unique to every organism and is the basis of how the body or how a organism is built and what the components are and what the characteristics of that organism is. DNA is the very instructions of life. And it's funny how scientists want to continue to come to randomness until there's information or until there's order, and then like, aha, order. Well, how is order recognized by that piece, by that little piece of strand of protein? Again, I'm incredulous, and I question this because it deserves to be questioned, because you're making huge claims here that just can't be substantiated.
Proteins when expressed. Jim is way out of his element when it comes to informatics. Then he says something unintelligible about how if the DNA was provided, we still wouldn't know how to put the bacterium together. Again, this is ridiculous, because the DNA is literally what contains the instructions to put the bacterium together. I find it hard to believe that Jim does not understand how gene expression works, so this may just be dishonesty on his part.
You say, well,
So accusing someone of being dishonest, okay, maybe we should rethink that. Jim Tour certainly understands all these things, and I think his audience versus Dave's audience, Professor Dave's audience, is people who are in the scientific community, who are students or teachers, which you would call his choir that he preaches to, as they say in church, preaching to the choir. And James Tour's audience, in most cases, is the everyday person. So you can see where James Tour may not be scientifically accurate to convey a point. And what the point that I believe he's trying to make, and you can watch James Tour's entire presentation, he's got a number of them, is that given the components, and that's making a huge statement, giving the components of DNA, how does that then trigger a reaction in an environment that creates all of the components for an organism to come together? So the point of the bacterium, because it's considered a simple mechanism, a simple organism, which really isn't. And Michael Behe goes in great detail about how the flagellum works, and it's basically a motor. It's a biomechanical motor. And that was laughed at, but there really is no. When you look at the components, it's literally gears that create the flagellum in this bacteria for it to work. This is a biomechanical motor designed for a particular purpose. Now, that's an scientifically uneducated, unqualified believer in God making a common sense, looking at something and coming to a conclusion. So I admit all of those things. And if you want to make fun of me for that, if you want to ignore me for that, if you want to insult me for that, please. That doesn't matter. The offense of Christ is well worth it, because at the end of the day, what's proposed by Professor Dave and people like him it's mind-boggling in the sense that to come to the conclusion they do, it's a big reach. It's a big reach to try to explain something that's unexplainable. And he admits that they can't explain it. He even says if we can't create stars and planets, that doesn't mean nature couldn't. Again, chance, time, with no explanation of coming from nothing. Remember, this whole thing is about abiogenesis, something from nothing. So that has to be kept in mind. And everything he talks about, he literally will admit, has to have precursors, has to have things that are ahead of it, has to have things that line up perfectly. I would consider like rolling a bowling ball around the earth perfectly and never stopping and hitting every pin, millions and billions of pins all around the earth for thousands of years with never coming to a stop. And that's what we're talking about, that level of impossibility. So that's my opinion, that's my approach, that's my perspective, and I'm just taking this to, I want to bring this out to the public and get people to think about it and talk about it.
We can make the liposome, the cell membrane. We cannot. There's over 40,000 lipids have been identified in cell membranes. You want to take some simple ones? It's not just individual lipid membranes. You have to have the inside and the outside of the membrane have to be different. You have to have this huge array of proteins, that transmembrane proteins.
More straw man arguments. Jim is talking about cells as they exist today, and in describing the plethora of surface proteins, it sounds like he may even be talking specifically about eukaryotic animal cells. This is something he brings up all the time, the complexity of a cell, and he will talk about microtubules and different organelles and wonder about how that all could have come together by chance. Well, it didn't. No one is proposing that. Eukaryotic cells came about through endosymbiosis from the merging of prokaryotic life forms, which existed for at least 1 billion years before such endosymbiotic events occurred. And even prokaryotic life had refined and complexified itself dramatically over that time. The first protocell didn't have to have a single surface protein. It didn't have DNA, it had RNA. It was unrecognizably simple compared to any cell that exists on Earth today. Jim seems to want abiogenesis to explain how life as it exists today could have come about spontaneously, and that's a straw man for the record books. No one proposes anything resembling that.
So again, he's taking the point that James Tour is saying life instantly creates these complexities, and Professor Dave is taking the position that no, it doesn't. It takes time and chance. I think that makes it pretty clear. I don't really have to say a whole lot on that. He literally makes that claim, time and chance. Over time, things get better and they improve. Have anybody observed this? Has anybody seen things improve? Do houses not need painting? Do even structures not need some maintenance? Do trees not need continuous food and supply? Do they get more no, they get bigger, but they don't change to something else. Trees stay trees. An oak tree stays an oak tree. A particular oak tree, a water oak stays a water oak. It never changes, though it might get rotten, it might get eaten by bugs, it might fall. It's still that. But he's trying to distance himself from James Tour's condensing of that life came to maturity, which we believe, and he will even say and claim that I'd rather believe in a God who creates it all from nothing rather than a God who creates it a little bit here and there and needs to mix it and tweak it, which I don't know where he gets this idea from, but he'll definitely say that later. I'll show you. But again, keep this in mind, and he's saying it over and over and over again. Give it enough time, give it enough time, give it enough time. These things could maybe happen.
Pretending the first protocell and eukaryotic animal cells are the same thing is like pretending a shack made of twigs is the Taj Mahal. There is no comparison. The complexity of eukaryotic cells evolved slowly over several billion years, once biological processes were already firmly in place. This is well understood by any biology undergraduate student.
It's well understood because in middle school they were taught this, and then it was compounded, and it was taught as the only way, and it's the only way that they can pose these type of things is slowly over billions of years. You have to have time to have enough cycles of these things to produce this. But why? And again, asking why when you're talking about randomness is silly. There is no why in random. There is no why. There's no purpose to any of this. Yet, when things form certain structures, all of a sudden they stop being random, and all of a sudden they become the basis of building life. And DNA has been DNA. So has DNA evolved, or is DNA still DNA? Is RNA still RNA? Why hasn't that gone a different direction? Why hasn't that fallen apart? Why is it continuously replicating and creating the same things over and over and over again? It just doesn't make sense. And again, unscientific, uneducated person, I know. I have no business having this discussion with anybody. I have no business questioning the patrons here, the learned, ancient, wise people who know everything and know what's right and good for us. So I'm sorry I'm taking these steps.
We need the nucleic acids, and then the homochiral systems that for the amino acids, which then need to be built up into protein structures. We need the carbohydrates, which have to be built up into the polycarbohydrate structures. And then we need the lipids, which also are chiral. All of these we need in homochiral form. We don't know how to do this in any prebiotic type scenario at all.
This is a reasonable point, or it would be if Jim was not a highly educated chemist that should know about existing research in this area. It is a fact that many biomolecules are homochiral, like L amino acids, and this begs explanation because stereospecific synthesis, where we get only one molecule of two possible mirror images, is difficult to do, even with sentient chemists driving the reactions. But Jim has not dug deep enough, as there are a multitude of plausible explanations for this, involving asymmetric heterogeneous catalysis on the mineral surfaces of tidal pools, or various mechanisms of enantiomeric resolution, which we will discuss later. Furthermore, not all of the molecules need to have been chiral to begin with. For some molecules, like lipids, it may have been a feature that evolved later, once proteins already existed, and therefore enzymes existed to carry out stereospecific synthesis, which ended up being favored by natural selection and is now a feature of all life billions of years later.
Okay, so here's where natural selection is favoring a certain thing. Now, when you say these things, you're putting evolution, natural selection, sort of like a judge or an arbiter of some sort that's saying this is good and this is not good, this will work and this won't work. I know he's not saying that. He'll never admit to something like that. He'll never like that explanation or that characterization. He won't like that. But he's saying that nature is making choices. And he'll say that in the context of statistics, that things get chosen because they are better. It just looks like they're chosen. So using words like chosen or favored is only a way for us to understand something that happens randomly. And it's the only way we can make that connection in our mind. He goes, it's only good, quote, good or workable if it is workable, if it survives all of these cycles or iterations. That's what makes something good, and that's what makes something appear to be favored, is it gains an advantage. But the idea that one thing might go through the cycle and one thing might find one cycle of improvement, to say that cycle of improvement gets spread and scales across a wide spectrum of organisms and components, you got to ask yourself, is that reasonable? And he wants you to make you think that it is reasonable. It happened here, therefore it could happen all the time. If it happened once, it could happen 10 billion times. It's playing with statistics. There's a famous book written, How to Lie with Statistics. You can use statistics to say anything you want, but he can't substantiate it himself. He can only say, probably, this is plausible, this could happen, we thought that this could happen, these are ways, there's a pathways, these are ways. If you stick this guy on a Donald Trump election chances, he'd probably see 10,000 ways that Donald Trump wins or loses, depending on his bias. And he is biased. He's admittedly a bigot against religion. So I hope you're understanding this and following through just these terms, and this is very technical. He gets into describing all of these things. His audience is are scientific type people, not the normal everyday person. So you're going to have to, if you want to, just dig into these definitions and find out what they mean and make sense of them yourself. But I think if you look at the context, and he was clearly saying billions of years, you saw the little strand on the left and then billions of years, and you got this complexity. So from simple to complex, that's what he's preaching. Has anyone seen that function? Has everyone seen simple to complex actually work? Has that been proven? And I think therein lies the question.
He pretends no one has had any success in offering an explanation for this, and it's just not true.
And this misunderstanding has come because of the projections of those who work in the area of origin of life. They do one little thing and then they extrapolate it, and then they work with the press to ramp it up even more, and they project as if they really know it. And so the layperson reads this and says, you see, scientists understand.
This point I actually agree with, but I don't think it's fair to put the blame on scientists. The blame belongs to the press. The way science news is reported today is absolutely abysmal because of clickbait culture. What happens is that headlines typically fall into one of two categories. It's either, we just found out that everything we know about physics is wrong, or we just found out that there definitely are parallel universes and we can probably go there.